We will be discussing two books. We'll be discussing about Bengaluru. We'll be discussing about nature, environment. So I would like to first start asking Mr. Jairam Ramesh about his book, A Life in Nature, Indira Gandhi. For those who haven't read the book, why I read the foreword, but just if you could explain to the audience what made you write about this particular aspect of Indira Gandhi, not about her politics, but about her love for nature and what she did as a politician for environment in India.
Well, most people who write biographies of political personalities focus on their politics. And most people who write about political personalities have a view of that personality to begin with. So that bias gets reflected in the biography. Also, I find many biographies in this country are based on gossip, based on what you pick up, oral history. And I asked myself, can I do something different in the birth centenary year of Indira Gandhi, who falls in one of two categories. You either have people who hail her as Durga, or you have people who condemn her as the architect of the emergency. So these are the two polarized extremes you have. I think a story was waiting to be told about who Indira Gandhi really was. Not what I think she was, but who she thought she was. And therefore, this book sort of emerged because I was able to unearth in various archives, both in India and abroad, a lot of primary material which established the fact that Indira Gandhi was a very reluctant politician. She was actually an ardent environmentalist. Her whole life was a life that was in politics, but it was a life that embraced nature as well. So it's the intersection of politics and nature which defined Indira Gandhi. So that's the reason why I really wrote this book.
So the book basically looks at the life of Indira Gandhi from when she was a child to a reluctant politician to the prime minister. It looks at correspondences, at letters, at policies and laws which came into existence when she was a prime minister. In fact, the Silent Valley, the Mudumalai project. There are so many projects where her imprint was there, where she decided as an environmentalist that development will not take precedence over environment, right? But while researching on her, did you believe that there could have been more tougher decisions that she could have taken?
Well, the 4 laws that we have today in India for the environment, the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, the Water Pollution Control Act of 1974, the Air Pollution Control Act of 1981, and the Forest Conservation Act of 1980, of which Harini knows a lot. All these 4 laws, which today are in existence, were basically her brainchild. They were the brainchildren. They were the result of her directives to the bureaucracy on what needs to be done. The institutions that we have today, the Central Pollution Control Board, the State Pollution Control Boards, the Ministry of Environment, the much criticized Ministry of Environment, these were all her creations. So she's not just a historical figure when it comes to environment. She is a living figure when it comes to the environment. And many of the decisions that she took, which were controversial at that time, are today part and parcel of our daily discourse. Project Tiger, for example, the Silent Valley project in Kerala, which she went out of her way to protect, various Chilka bird sanctuary in Odisha, the saving of the lion in Gir forest in Gujarat. So there are umpteen examples of how what she did in the 70s and 80s continue to have relevance today. Remember, in the 70s, there was no discussion like this on environment. There were hardly any scholars on the environment. There were hardly any NGOs. The media was hardly interested. So she was in my view, she was the one political figure who made environment a day-to-day issue when she was Prime Minister. Very difficult to do so because you have multiple pressures. Put a refinery here, build a fertilizer plant there, build a highway here. And she had those pressures. But how she navigated those pressures in order to protect the environment, to protect nature, is really the story of this book.
So I read one of Harini's reviews on the book, Harini. If you could also explain why you made that particular observation, which is, if you read the book, it seems like, especially Indira Gandhi's Stockholm speech, she's someone who did not who did not look at the top-down position, right? But when it came to population control in this country, she actually endorsed that top-down position. So what was your take on that, Harini?
Actually, it wasn't as much a take as a question. That I think one thing I found fascinating about the book is it talks about the challenges of being a politician. You might believe in certain things personally, but you have to deal with a lot of pressures of balancing different, voices in your party or voices in the country and opinions, especially on the population issue as well as the issue of people and forests. Those are two questions that I had, because it seemed clear from these writings that she had one personal position, which was that population itself was not the driving force for problems of the environment. It was consumption and lifestyles, a certain kind of consumptive lifestyle. But it's
when she blamed lifestyle for that, why did she have a top-down approach for population control?
Well, her views on forests, for example, changed because of the Chipko movement. That was a defining moment in India's environmental history. Many of you may recall that in the late 1970s, the women of Uttarakhand hugged the trees to save the trees from being cut by forest contractors. And this was called the Chipko movement. And it was that led Indira Gandhi to change her view on forests from a purely pristine ecological sanctuary type of a thing to something which has a larger social significance for communities and for people. So before 1980, she is not talking of people-oriented forestry. She's talking of protecting forests, protecting wildlife. But after 1980, she begins to talk about what do you do about the people who depend on forests? What do you do about the communities who are living in and around forest areas? So the Chipko movement was a very good example of how a political personality changed her perspective. Now, on population, it's very interesting. Indira Gandhi actually was the first prime minister to appoint a minister for family planning. It's interesting. India's first health minister. Now, I have nothing against people who are single, so this is not a sexist comment. India's first health minister was Rajkumari Amrit Kaur. Who said, what is the family planning all about? She was a spinster. She thought she was a Gandhian, and she thought that Gandhian methods are the best for family planning. India's second health minister was Sushila Nair, who was a Gandhian disciple. Again, she didn't have a family. She didn't think of family planning as a major challenge for India. So along comes Indira Gandhi and appoints the first minister for family planning. It's very interesting. Up to 1976, 75, she's talking of democratic methods, voluntary methods, not coercion, encouraging small families. So many of you are old enough to know, I certainly am old enough to know, that when I was going to school, the inverted triangle was such an ubiquitous feature. Hum do, hamare do. That was the slogan that was given at that time. But by 1975, 1976, she changes her mind. And she says that democracy has not worked. Voluntary methods have not worked. We must somehow push population. And I think this was the influence of her son, Sanjay Gandhi, more than anybody else. So from 1976 onwards, from 75 onwards, she stresses sterilizations as the main Up to 76, it was distribution of Nirod was the big thing in India. From 75 onwards, it becomes sterilizations. So 76 sees this enormous spurt in sterilizations, but in 1977, she loses the election because of the sterilizations in North India. And after 1980, she goes back to talking of democratic methods, of, voluntary methods. So that brief interregnum of 75 to 77 was the period in which she really believed that we need to force the pace of family planning, even though we had a two-child norm. But it's paradoxical that after that, most states in India followed the sterilization route. In fact, other than Kerala, which achieved stable population because of female literacy and gender empowerment, all states in India, including Tamil Nadu, stressed sterilizations. Andhra, Karnataka, Maharashtra, Punjab, all these states. In fact, there's a very famous birth control official of Tamil Nadu who became the father of family planning of Tamil Nadu. He was the chief secretary of Tamil Nadu for many years. His name was T.V. Antony. He was a great family planning advocate, and he was called tubectomy, vasectomy Antony. I mean, that was what he was called because, always pushing tubectomy, vasectomy. This is after Indira Gandhi had sort of paid the electoral prize for that. So, yeah, Ram Guha has described Indira Gandhi as a top-down environmentalist. She was a top-down environmentalist. She was not a bottom-up activist environmentalist. And I think the reason for that is the bottom-up guys came into existence only after the Narmada, only after the mid-80s. And after Bhopal happened, that you had grassroots activism in this country. Up to the mid-80s, it was Salim Ali, Zafar Fateh Ali, Indira Gandhi, few bird watchers, few tiger lovers, and of course the most important, all the Maharajas of India who in their youth had shot all tigers, but by middle age had become the most passionate conservationists. Maharaja of Mysore, Maharaja of Bharatpur, Maharaja of Kashmir, the Maharaja of Bhavnagar, all these Maharajas became the great conservationists, and they were all top-down guys. So there is a criticism of hers. It's a valid criticism, by the way, that she was not a person who looked at environment from the ground up. She looked at environment from the top down. It's true.
So Harini's book, Nature in the City, Bengaluru in the Past, Present and Future. So Harini's book looks at a lot of maps, Bengaluru from the 1700s, 1800s, and as a journalist, I'm amazed. Because to source two maps of Bangalore from 1990 or 1980 itself is a huge task. Wherever you go, they'll say, we don't have the maps, go to that department will say, but we don't keep the maps. So first, congratulations on getting all the data together. But what was your big learning really, Harini? Because you looked through Bangalore across decades, centuries. So what was your big learning as you did that research?
So, first, it's very interesting because as Jairam was saying, I've looked at forests for a long time, and I started doing my research in the early 90s looking at forests. I looked at Bangalore because that's the city I'm from, and I said it's strange that ecologists never look at the environments they spring from, which are rarely forested environments. So when I started looking at the long history of Bangalore, and I started, as you know, from the 6th century AD, so it's well before Kempegowda and when Bangalore was a collection of villages. You find that the city grew. I mean, it's an unusual old city that we're in because it's semi-arid. It doesn't get that much rainfall. It's not close to rivers. It's though it's on a plateau, it's still very hot. It didn't have too many trees. So villages came in successively based on the environment. They had to improve the environment to make it livable, for which they dug the tanks that we call lakes today, created water connections between them to store rainfall, planted trees to make it cooler for them, created different kinds of irrigated agriculture. So they transformed the landscape, which is very clear from the sets of inscriptions. Then various rulers, from Kempegowda's dynasty to Shaji, Shivaji's father, Tipu, Haidar, They all continued the same tradition of greening the city, which the British also did. So you have this very clear relationship over centuries that the more people you have, the more trees you have, the more lakes you have, the more water you have. So there's this positive relationship almost. And what I think for me was very striking was we tend to think that it's inevitable that nature perishes in cities. Clearly, these early settlers didn't think so. They improved the landscape, right, over centuries. Then at some point, the relationship breaks down because they stop looking at local sources. When a city becomes large enough, that, for instance, piped water comes in. You can get water from a pipe now. You don't need wells, you don't need lakes.
So you stop looking at those as sources of water.
You stop. Then the whole idea of them as sacred or life-giving goes away. So in a space of 5-6 years, from worshipping wells and lakes, they go to dumping corpses in them at times of plague. The whole relationship breaks down. Similarly with trees, a while later, it's still the 1980s that we keep greening Bangalore, but at that time, you want to have, when the cars come in and the city becomes a city of cars, then you start cutting down all the trees. And that's when our dependence has gone. But what I'd like to show at the end, which is why it's Bangalore also in the future, is that now I think we're realizing the illusion of, how long can a city suck resources from far away, right? You can't get water. We're all running out of water. And therefore, you have a lot of community movements springing up with lake conservation. I see, in fact, several groups that I know here. Similarly, air pollution is so much on the rise that people are coming together with for the steel flyover to defeat the plans for the ill-conceived steel flyover to save the 2,000 plus trees. Because you realize that the impacts of air pollution on yourselves and your families and the next generations are going to be that severe. So that's the loop I'm trying to chart of how our relationship to nature changes with urbanization, first for the positive, then the negative, and then hopefully a new positive can emerge.
But my only doubt when I read the book is that you speak a lot about community projects in Bangalore, about citizens coming together. And I also see it as a journalist. But do you still believe that's enough for the kind of damage that is being done?
Absolutely not. So definitely the state needs to be picking up so the communities can only do local projects. And anything at a larger scale, whether it's forest conservation or if it's, looking at urban conservation issues, you must have planning and the government must come in with its role to do the planning and the coordination. For instance, if you have somebody, dumping trash in a lake or picking up a piece of a lake and building an apartment complex, communities can't take them on. So, those kinds of things, you have to have a strong state stepping in and that is where I think the dysfunctionality happens. The one sign of hope I see is that when you have sustained pressure, especially in a city of this kind, I think community pressure can force the state to act in ways that it might not have acted before. Similarly with forest conservation, I think the Forest Rights Act to bring power for communities to conserve their forests happened a lot because of grassroots movements putting pressure on political parties and then on the government. So that's the way I see it going. You have to have the government to act, but if they're not going to act, then you have to have citizen pressure that makes them act.
So citizen pressure does work and they better keep it in. In the book, there were so many letters, right, which Indira Gandhi wrote. There are letters which she wrote to chief ministers, to bureaucrats. The book chronicles a lot many letters. Does this happen even now? Do prime ministers take personal interest in, you're an environment minister yourself. Do they take personal interest in nature, in conservation, or is it just left to the environment minister to do?
I think she was the first and last prime minister to make environment a part of her day-to-day concerns, a day-to-day concern. That's why the book is organized not thematically but chronologically. What I've tried to show was in 1971, we are about to go to war with Pakistan. And she's having 2 days of discussions on how to have a new law for protecting wildlife. It's completely bizarre to me, but it wasn't bizarre to her, obviously, because in the midst of all her, she's nationalizing banks and she's talking about protecting the lion. She's going through serious economic and political crisis, and she's talking about Project Tiger in early 1973. So the question now you ask, she is the first and last prime minister to find time every day amidst her political and economic preoccupations to devote some time to meeting some environmentalist, to discussing some issue relating to the environment, whether it's rivers, mountains, forests, wildlife, whatever it could be. And I think that's the remarkable feature of Indira Gandhi. This morning, when I saw the newspapers, I was pleasantly surprised. In fact, I was shocked to see a review of this book in Pioneer. Now, those of you who know the politics of Pioneer, it's a newspaper that comes out of Delhi. It's owned by a former BJP MP. The politics of Pioneer is completely anti-Indira Gandhi, completely anti-Congress. But it has a full-page encomiums to Indira Gandhi, the environmentalist. And I asked myself, now, why would this guy be doing this? You know, Chandan Mitra has no love lost for Indira Gandhi, the politician. Has no love lost for the emergency, no love lost for the fact that she belonged to the Congress. Why would he go out of his way to praise Indira Gandhi, the environmentalist, after reading the book? And it just struck me that one of the reasons for that is the fact that whenever she spoke, you mentioned Stockholm. She went to Stockholm and she quoted from the Atharva Veda. She would go and speak to audiences and quote from some Upanishad or some Rig Veda or some old Sanskrit shlokas she would dig out from somewhere. She had this little diary of shlokas which she would write and use. And I think the point that I've tried to make is that she was trying to tell Indians that protecting nature is not alien to Indian nature, to Indian culture. Western culture is based on man's conquest of nature. Indian culture has been based on man's living in harmony with nature. But somehow we have lost that old principle. One of, Swami Chidananda of the Divine Life Society writes to her about the destruction of the Himalayas. And she writes back to the Swami. I mean, it's like carrying coals to Newcastle, but she writes to the Swami, yes, I agree with you. Prakriti rakshati rakshataha. Nature protects those who protect it. I mean, no Western civilization has this reverence for nature that Indian culture has. However, we have lost that reverence. We have lost that relationship. And I think what she was trying to remind us, politicians, students, journalists, media, is that this is something that comes naturally to you. Nature is part of every Indian's DNA. Discover it and start protecting nature. And that's her basic message that was coming out.
Okay, since you spoke about Swamis and I'm a journalist, what do you think about the rally for rivers and so many Swamis and Sadgurus and everyone getting into this whole environment, the talk on environment? I mean, both of you can answer this question because I think a lot of...
there are Swamis who destroy rivers also, by the way.
Yes, a lot of them, but they don't speak openly about it. So a lot of this talk on environment these days are hijacked, I believe, by these conversations. So do you have... and you see so many governments have come forward now to actually support...
I think it's, I don't think that we should give a sectarian or a communal or a religious connotation to the protection of nature. It has cultural significance. It's part of our civilizational heritage and we need to protect it because we have future generations to come. I've also been reading it's an index of how fashionable environmental protection has become, and that everybody wants to now get on to the environmental bandwagon. But whether something actually will happen, I would rather that Swamis protect floodplains rather than do anything else.
Okay. Harini, so my question to you is, like he said, it's become fashionable now to speak about the environment. When we talk about Bengaluru, because we are also focusing on Bangalore in this panel, right? Do you think there's a disconnect between various departments here, first thing, between what they want and what ultimately gets done, and there is no real long-term vision for the city as such?
I think if you look at the tragedy of urban growth today, it's become an issue of who gets how much money out of what and who gets how much benefit out of what. So there's a lot of lip service paid to the environment. There's very little that is done. I think our plans are always reasonably good. So if you look at, for instance, Bangalore or many cities and their planning, their master plans at every decade, the amount of green space that they prescribe per citizen, per person, has actually increased over the past decades in terms of the plans. The actuality has shrunk over time. So you see this divergence. The plans are getting better, the reality is getting worse. A lot of that is just that government departments don't talk to each other and coordinate, but a lot of this is just that their incentive structure is very different and they're motivated by different things. So it's very clear, I think, if you look at Bangalore, there is a lot of money put behind lake rejuvenation because these are large projects and there is always money to be made. But there's also, very often it's very easy for citizens to engage, for instance, community groups to engage with lake restoration. Very difficult for them to stop tree cutting because stopping tree cutting means stopping a flyover or a road widening project where also there's money. So there's, the political economy of a lot of this drives what we see, in fact.
So where do you think we're going horribly wrong? Like she said, the political economy versus this need to protect the environment. Since you've been the environment minister, where do you think we are going horribly wrong now? Or went wrong while you were there too?
Well, it's very difficult navigating the middle path between the need for high economic growth and protecting the environment. You need jobs, you need investment, you need highways, you need railway projects, you need industrialization, you need urbanization. How do you do it in an environmentally sustainable manner? I mean, that's the big challenge. There's no toolkit. There's no formula that you follow. But I think the lesson that I draw from Indira Gandhi's life, or more specifically her prime ministerial tenure, is that you have to be politically courageous enough to take a decision one way or the other and stick to that decision. I'll give you two examples which will illustrate what you are saying. There is an petroleum refinery in Mathura. It is 60 kilometers from the Taj Mahal and 50 kilometers from the Bharatpur Bird Sanctuary. And Indira Gandhi, for all her environmentalism, laid the foundation stone for that refinery on the 2nd of October 1973. And she told the engineers, now that I have laid the foundation stone, you go all over the world and find the best pollution control technology. Now, to me, that's a crazy decision. If I was the minister, I would have said, don't locate the refinery in the first place. Why do all this pollution control business afterwards? However, because of economic considerations, development of UP, availability of broad gauge, availability of highway, a decision was taken to locate it in Mathura. There, the economic constituency won. Silent Valley. Huge project in Silent Valley. The left parties want it. The Congress party wants it. Everybody in her own cabinet wants it. But Indira Gandhi sits tight for 3 years, and at the end of 3 years, she says, sorry, Silent Valley is too valuable, it will be protected, no project in Silent Valley.
But why do you think she arrived at that conclusion in spite of Madhav Gadgil not being...
She knew from day one what she wanted. See, in politics, the process is more important than the product. She knew what she wanted in 1980. But she went through a democratic process of consultations, gave everybody a feeling that he or she had been heard. NGOs, media, scientists, politicians, everybody. And in the end, she took the decision. She knew what she wanted. So she appeared for 3 years to be this great listening mode. She had made up her mind. So I think it's important in open societies, in democratic societies, to listen to people, to consult. You may have made up your mind, but go through the process of consultation, which she did in Silent Valley. Now, in Silent Valley, the growth guys felt she had been very unfair. And all of Kerala was completely agitated and aghast, other than the NGOs. I, in fact, coincidentally, happened to be in Trivandrum the day she announced that decision. I had just joined the government, and that day was in Trivandrum. And there was an electricity minister in Kerala called Balakrishna Pillai, who's still alive. And Balakrishna Pillai gave a statement, which the front page of the Malayalam Manorama, which said, Indira Gandhi prefers monkeys to Malayalis. Because the lion-tailed macaw was the main habitat, was the Silent Valley. And he was saying that, here's a prime minister who's not bothered about Kerala, and she wants to protect a few monkeys, 195 monkeys. And this was a debate that took place. So the answer, Dhanya, is that it is a trade-off. There is a conflict. Choices have to be made. But how the choices are made, how the trade-off is actually worked, depends on the democratic process of decision making. It's a complicated thing. It's not an easy thing.
So one thing I found actually most fascinating about the book was this insight into the times when the environment won and the times when the environment lost.
Absolutely.
Because I think we talk very glibly about win-win situations all the time, and most of the time they're win-lose. One wins and the other side loses. And coming back to the cities question, I wish it's just that in cities across India, it seems like the environment is always on the losing side because the pressure is always economic development and economic growth and infrastructure growth. And it seems like there is no consideration to this one, some you win, some you lose. It's always that we can fix the environment.
Actually,
the environment later.
her life is a good example of some you lose, some you win. I don't know how many of you have been to Chilka Bird Sanctuary, huge bird sanctuary in Odisha. The Indian Navy has put a boys' training establishment there for 3 years. She said yes, then she said no. She said yes, then she said no. Finally, she said yes. So she lost a lot of battles. She lost the Chilka battle. She lost the refinery battle. But I think the point that she's making, that to win a war, you have to lose some battles. You have to be prepared to lose some battles. And environmentalists in India, certainly, cannot hope to win every battle. It's simply not possible. There will be a backlash. So you have to understand there are situations where environment will take a back seat. Fight for the bigger causes. Fight for the big things.
Okay, so are there any questions from the audience? Yes. I think they'll hand over the mics.
Dhanya. Oh, the review. No, the review, I think the reviewer was very happy that he found in Indira Gandhi a person who was looking to ancient Indian scriptures for the roots of Indian approach to environment. I think that's what made him feel, this is somebody who can quote the Vedas and the Upanishads and, pick out an appropriate Sanskrit shloka at an appropriate point of time to tell us that nature is sacred. And I think that's an important insight that she had.
Yes.
Is it worth looking at any other city globally or on some other country who has actually been a role model in terms of balancing this environment versus industry? Why I'm saying that is that, from time to time we get politicians saying that, Bangalore should become a Singapore, Gurdaspur should become a Paris, and London, Calcutta and all that. But in your stint as environment minister and your researchers, are there cities that we should look at as role models and then say that we could do XYZ to make it better? May not be perfect.
With the same kind of population, it would be difficult, I guess, but yes.
I think we need to start looking at southern cities for inspiration. So, if you look at Curitiba and the bus rapid transport systems, or China is now promoting sponge cities, so wetlands as natural sponges for floods. There's a lot of homegrown things in different southern cities. It's more fashionable to look to Paris or Singapore for solutions, but our solutions are not going to be found.
I don't think you should look at London and Paris. They are completely wrong cities to look at. No country in the world will add 400 million people in the next 30 years. Most of it in urban areas. No country in the world. Most countries in the world are either facing stable population or declining population or aging population. We are the only country in the world which is going to add 400 million people and which will continue to have a median age in the low 30s. Solutions will have to be homegrown. We'll have to discover our own solutions. I don't think that there is any city that we can say that, okay, this is what these guys are doing. Some elements are there. Antwerp is one city where 70% of the water is recycled. Now, we can learn from Antwerp about recycling, but Antwerp's population is less than 1 million. And look at Bangalore's population, it's 10 times, more than 10 times that.
This is for Jairam Ramesh. This is regarding Silent Valley. You mentioned that Indira Gandhi stopped the project. It was only due to the stiff opposition from the local people, the media, environmentalists, and the tribals that the project was stopped.
In Silent Valley. Sorry? In Silent Valley?
Yes.
Absolutely. In Silent Valley, had the local activists not been so aggressive, Silent Valley would not have become a national or international issue. And the Silent Valley activists got to Mrs. Gandhi, and she actually went to Trivandrum in 1980, in January 1980, and that's when she said that the Silent Valley must be protected. So she was absolutely, her antenna were out. Half the things that she has done, which I have described in the book, is because of Salim Ali. Salim Ali would just write her a letter. And she would swing into action. How many of you have been to Bharatpur? And the way Bharatpur got saved is because Salim Ali kept sending her letters after letters that Bharatpur is being destroyed. And, she moved decisively to save the Bharatpur bird sanctuary. So, absolutely, meeting environmentalists, interacting with them, getting them on board is a very important element of a Prime Minister's job, which unfortunately she was the first and last to do.
Another threat is from a dam which is coming up in Adirampalli Falls in Kerala.
She's saying there is a dam coming up near the Adirapalli waterfalls in Thrissur district, right? Yeah, in Thrissur district. So,
well, yeah, Adirapalli is a modern-day Silent Valley. There are people who are opposed to it. There are people who are pushing it now. The local activists, there's a very strong local movement. Atirapalli, in this state itself, there is the Gundia hydroelectric project in the Western Ghats. So there are many dam projects, large dam projects in ecologically sensitive areas that will test the genuineness of any government's commitment to protecting the environment and nature.
yes.
Before I begin the question, I have a little disagreement with what you said in terms of population in India. If you look at the surface area of UK and the surface area of Karnataka and the population in terms of density, we're pretty much the same. If they can govern themselves, we too can. So I don't think population is a good excuse for anything. My question to you, Jairam Ramesh, is you spoke about the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach in most of things. But I feel there is a way in between where, like chartered accountants, for example, environmentalists, there are enough environmental professionals in the country. Why don't you delegate a lot of this work to professionals instead of some sadhu having to take over the cause or some bureaucrat or politician who doesn't even know the subject have to create rules for this? Why don't you let us professionals handle it?
Let's ask any other question probably.
Why did you let professionals handle it?
Why do you let sadhus, bureaucrats, politicians who have no clue about environment deal with
Ultimately, decisions are taken politically. We are a political system. Let's not wish politics away.
No.
We want to take decisions democratically, in which professionals have their say. But ultimately, the decision has to be taken by the government of the day, whichever that government.
But you're saying
And I
decision-making
respect.
process, I think,
But the
right?
process, I think everybody should get involved, and I don't think that you can say that in our country professionals don't have a say. Professionals do have a say.
A very
There are
small
good
thing.
professionals and there are co-opted professionals. I can give you examples of professionals who told me what I wanted to hear. And I had to tell the professionals, be professional, don't be political.
Well,
You know?
Is that a good excuse?
But I don't disagree with you. I mean, I entirely agree with you. We need. I tried to involve this young lady, in some of the work when I was minister. You need people. You need more people who have expert knowledge. But
How easy is it for us to participate in that decision?
One drawback of professionals. I've been a professional in my life also. So I can say this. Professionals tend to look at issues from their narrow viewpoint, narrow perspective. Decision making involves multiple stakeholders, multiple viewpoints, conflict resolution. I've just come from a discussion on Aadhaar. It's a classic example
I was there as well.
of professional versus political. Professionally, Aadhaar gets 10 out of 10. Politically, Aadhaar gets maybe 3 out of 10 or 2 out of 10. So we should involve the best knowledge, best expertise, but the structure has to be a political structure. That's what I would say.
Okay. We have time for just one more question. Yes.
Yeah, hi. My name's Avinash. I take part of this river march in Mumbai. Saving the rivers of Mumbai. So my question is, now if you see Sadhguru and everyone is rally for rivers, so do you think rejuvenation of rivers is possible, and how is it going to be possible?
Well,
See, Sadhguru is in fashion. Right?
it's we don't have rivers in this country anymore.
We have Nala.
We have sewers. Rivers have become sewers,
Nala.
or rivers have been dammed. So we have one of the two types of rivers. So we have a serious issue, serious problem ahead of us. The first and most important action that the government can do to revive rivers is to ensure that no untreated municipal sewage or untreated industrial effluent is let into rivers. 70% of the pollution in the Ganga is because of municipal sewage being let into the Ganga untreated. So first thing we need to do is to ensure that either municipal sewage or industrial effluent that gets into the rivers gets in only after primary, secondary and tertiary treatment. Number one. Number two, large number of rivers, Mandakini, Alaknanda, Bhagirathi, in the upper reaches of the Ganga particularly, are vanishing because we are building large number of dams, in sequence. The Tista, for example, in West Bengal, another good example. So we must now seriously consider a moratorium on dam building on rivers on which you already have a large number of dams, and not add to it, because you need water to flow in the rivers. That's the second thing. Third thing that you need to do is, in the upper catchment area, you need to carry out major reforestation activities. I think it's possible, if you 25, 30 years, to bring back water in our rivers. But it's not going to happen in my lifetime, I can tell you. It may happen in yours.
Yeah, Harini.
I think also a sacred conception of any type of nature, whether it's water or forest, can be a positive, but unfortunately can also become a negative. So if you look at a lot of our students' research now on, for instance, Ganga, or what do you find sacred? Sometimes when you think that a river is so sacred, you cannot pollute it, you are blind to the fact, or you think that post Ganesha festival, you can't pollute a river because you can throw Ganesha, plaster of Paris. It's when that image becomes so overwhelming that nothing you can do can destroy your view of this as sacred, but yet you go on polluting. I think that's where this relationship has gone wrong somewhere, and we need to fix that deeply.
I'll give you, if I have half a minute, in the Ganga, near Varanasi, there's a small island that got created some 10 years ago, and we used that as a habitat for turtles. Now you may ask, why turtles? Because I was told by some professional that turtles eat half-burnt human bodies, and Varanasi was full of half-burnt human bodies. And this was one intervention that was done in some of the ghats. So the point that Harini is making is that we worship the rivers, but we pollute the rivers with equal vengeance. I mean, it's a paradoxical thing. We worship the rivers, we pollute the rivers. We worship the mountains, we desecrate the mountains. We worship the forests, we deforest. So I think the general rule which I have come to the conclusion after my long life in public service is that if you want to ignore something, start worshipping it.
Yes.
Thank you. So hope you had a good time. I think the big takeaway for me is a moratorium on building dams, which India should perhaps seriously look at now. If you have more questions, I'm sure they can answer a few behind stage if they have time. Thank you very much.